Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. If you're having any trouble with hearing me, just type in the chat and someone should be able to help you. Um, Great, that's good to know, thanks. Right, so welcome to the Waves webinar and thank you so much for taking the time to actually join us on this webinar. So my name's Sheetal. I'm Sheetal Kavia from St George's University. I'm a project manager here and I'm actually the Waves project manager. And with me I have Terry Poulton. Terry, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Terry Poulton. I'm the Professor of e-learning and medical education at St George's. Nominally the project coordinator, although I have to say in Waves, Sheetal does almost all of the work. There we are. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to take you through what we have proposed today for the webinar. What we are thinking of doing is actually taking you through just basics, which you already know, what the Waves project is and some of the main deliverables. Then the main bulk of the webinar will be to go through the actual MOOC that we have planned for the project, take you through some of the content that we're planning for that and the structure of it. Then finally, we'll go into actually getting some feedback from yourselves about the MOOC and how you can get involved moving forward, and also any details and things like that that you may need or we may need from you at the end. So, WAVES. WAVES stands for Widening Access to Virtual Educational Scenarios, and it's a project funded by the European Commission under the Erasmus Plus program under the Knowledge Alliance section within there. And it started in January 2016 and it's running until the end of this year, December 2018. And with the Knowledge Alliance programs, what happens is they actually collaborate between higher education institutions and business sector as well. So St George's University is the lead partner within this project, and the other higher educational institutions that we have are Masaryk University, who are from Czech Republic. We have Karolinska Institutet from Sweden, and we also have Aristotle University of Thessaloniki from Greece. And the two business partners that we have is Bayer, who are a large pharmaceutical company, and we also have Instruct, who are the developers of one of the virtual scenario authoring platforms called Carsus. So together, our aim is to actually make scenario-based learning more accessible to a wide range of professionals. So beyond just our partnership, beyond the network, we're hoping that other disciplines, other professions may want to take up scenario-based learning for their teaching or training, wherever that may be. So some of the main deliverables within the project, we have the network itself, so the Waves network, which all of you are a part of, and that is to build on relationships, make new collaborations, maybe potential new projects and things like that between partners and the network, and to share ideas as well of how people are using scenario-based learning together. The other bit of the project is to actually create these toolkits, and the toolkit is developed to make a technical toolkit and a knowledge toolkit. So there's two different toolkits, and within the toolkit, what we're hoping to have is some examples of ways you can integrate your virtual scenarios within your existing learning management systems. Also, attached to that will be some guidelines on how you may implement these things yourself, how you might actually create some virtual scenarios yourself as well. And we've got some guides in there about how to make good virtual scenarios and giving you some tips as well on what things you should consider. And all of this will be drawn together and will be delivered through a MOOC as well. So the MOOC will be a part of the toolkit and it will kind of bring everything together. So I'll pass it on to Terry, who will tell you a bit more about MOOCs.
Yes, to explain MOOCs briefly, stands for Massive Open Online Courses. And what makes them disruptive to educational process and courses so far is that they are, well, initially they were entirely free. They're still free to register and usually free to content. And the disruption, of course, is then caused by the fact that they attract huge numbers of users. The record in the UK is, I think, 600,000 at the moment. And they're delivered in different platforms than the platforms that we're used to in our universities, Moodle and Blackboard, etc. They're delivered in specific programs. The examples are here: edX, FutureLearn, Coursera, Khan, Udacity. And the one that we use, of course, is FutureLearn. Come to that later. It's a different kind of demographic. The learners are 80 to 90% are over 22, according to a survey last year. So they're generally between 20 and 40. The other part of that demographic that's different is that because this is a global course, then 45% of learners, nearly half now, are from emerging economies. And tied in quite closely with that is the fact that 40% of the learners use mobiles for learning, but actually 25%, and that number is increasing, 25% use mobile only. The most popular courses are short courses, and that's emerging as the MOOC strength at the moment. These are courses which last 2 to 5 or 6 weeks. And because of that, they're often called now micro credentials, short courses, which can be built up into larger programs. And those programs can even be conventional programs like diplomas and master's courses. The learners, the numbers, of course, are increasing all the time on these courses, and that's because the learners see a clear career benefit. More than 80% think it actually improves their career, but actually 30% in a recent survey found that they had a direct benefit, whether it be an increase in salary or a new job or just simply promotion. And I mentioned they were free, but in fact, the way in which universities are starting to make profit is that they will certificate these courses. They give certificates to the courses, and learners may use the content freely, but if they want to carry on using it for a long time, they pay, and if they want a certificate, they pay. And there are other ways in which they pay for assessment, etc. If I can move to the next slide. Maybe you better do that, Sheetal, before I press the wrong button. Our MOOC platform is FutureLearn. FutureLearn's an offshoot of the Open University. It's staffed by many ex-Open University employees and also many of the people from the tremendous learning systems in the BBC. It's called the Storytellers MOOC because typically the way in which it unfolds its knowledge is through telling a story. And so it's very strong on pedagogical principles, and those principles tend to be social constructivism. If you, for those who are interested, social constructivism really, I suppose, is just about saying that knowledge is acquired by sharing with others. As I mentioned before, the income comes from the purchase of certificates, and those certificates now may attract points for continuing professional development, credits for that. And to give an example, one of our courses has CPD points from 3 separate Royal Colleges in medicine. So sometimes people buy them for those CPD credits. I think that is enough on MOOCs for me.
Thank you. Okay, so before I take you in through to the MOOC and show you the structure, the things that I want you guys to consider is the course material understandable? Do you think there's too much detail? Do you think anything is lacking detail and probably needs a bit more explanation? Is there anything missing? And is it what you expected of a MOOC of this type? So they're the things that I'd like you to consider as we're going through. So let's go through to the MOOC. Right. So the MOOC is actually organized into 3 weeks, and each week has its own title. So the first week is on scenario-based learning, second being on virtual scenarios, and the third being developing a virtual scenario. Then each week is then divided into activities. Now, an activity is just a way of organizing the content of that week into sections or small modules. So the first week, which is called scenario-based learning, is split into 5 activities. First one being introduction to the course, second being introduction to scenario-based learning, third being importance of storytelling, then it goes on to cognition and decision making, and finally the summary. So if I take you into one of those activities, so the first activity of that week is, the third activity is introduction to scenario-based learning. And within each activity, you have a number of steps, and this is where you start getting all the learning content. So a step can be either an article step, an audio step, video, quiz, discussion, or exercise step. So within the introduction to scenario-based learning, the first step is called Why Scenario-Based Learning. And that's a video, so it's a short video that users can go through and learn about scenario-based learning. Following on from that, we have why do we use scenario-based learning, or how do we use scenario-based learning? And this is an article step. And then finally, you've got a discussion about what the learner's experience is of scenario-based learning. So if we take a closer look at each one of those steps, we've got the video step, which is why scenario-based learning. Now, if it was an audio step, you'd have a similar thing where you can see the picture. That would be where the audio clip is, but in this one, that's a video. And then if you look on the right hand side, you can see the text that follows on from that step. So you've got YSBL, and then we've got a short description of what was covered in the video. So if I move on, the next step, which is an article step on how do we use scenario-based learning, you can see it's an article about just describing how we use scenario-based learning currently. So within large lectures or presentations, or within small group teaching such as role plays, problem-based learning, flipped classroom, team-based learning. And unfortunately, I couldn't get the whole article on here, but then it follows on and talks about how you can use it as self-directed learning for individuals, whether it be in the workplace or at home. And you can see with the article steps, you're able to put in images and things like that as well. So it's not just text. And then moving on from that, the last step was a discussion step. As our MOOC isn't live yet, we haven't actually got any responses. So what I've done here is I've actually given you what a discussion step would look like. This is from one of our other courses that we have on FutureLearn. You can see that the question is there, what do you think? You've got a bit of explanation just to give the learners a bit of guidance on what they need to answer. Then on the right hand side, what you can see is that each user has actually gone in and commented on that step. And you can see on the first comment, it's actually got 5 likes. So you can actually go in and like the comments. And then it's also got a response. Someone's actually replied to that comment as well. So you're able to follow people. For example, if you are a educator, you're able to follow them in the MOOC. So you can see all their discussions and comments that they make. And you can respond directly to comments, and you can like them as well. And then you can filter and arrange them as you wish. So that's just an example of a discussion step there. And then moving on, so the rest of that week is about the importance of storytelling. So we have why is storytelling important, the science behind it, what kind of chemical reactions do we have in our brains when we listen to stories, and how engaged we are. Then we deconstruct a story and talk about the different elements within a story and what makes a really good story. And then finally, we talk about, we ask the learners to actually discuss one of their favorite stories or something they've read recently, and think about um, how they can identify the different elements within that story. So it gets discussion going again. This is followed by the activity on cognition and decision making. So we talk about what it is that we're doing in our heads when we're looking at scenarios and thinking about actually making decisions within workplace and real life situations, and how it is that with decision making, the cognitive process is affected depending on different factors. So we'll go into that. And then finally, for the week one, we've got summaries just to kind of round up the whole week and say what we've learned during that week. So then we move on to week two, which is called virtual scenarios. And this is slightly shorter than the first week. So we've got started off with an introduction to the whole week to give an overview. Then we'll talk about what is a virtual scenario, and we'll give some examples in there of the different types you can get as well. Then the learners will actually get an opportunity to play some examples. And finally, then we have a discussion with the learners to find out what they consider to be what would make a good scenario. So what they may consider makes a good scenario. And maybe some people might have examples as well that they might want to share with the group. The second activity within week two is about planning your virtual scenario. So this is when we start getting the learners to actually think about what it is that they would need to consider before actually creating a virtual scenario. So things like aims and objectives, make sure that they're clearly identified and they're clearly labeled before they're actually creating the virtual scenario. We're also asking them to think about how they expect the virtual scenario to be used. Will it be used in a large teaching setting, or are they expecting it to be used in self-directed learning exercise where someone is sat at a computer on their own going through a scenario? And then finally, to also think about the type of media they may embed within the virtual scenario. Are they thinking of embedding some user guidelines? Are they expecting to embed some videos which they may have, may show different types of guidance or protocols that they must follow within the workplace? So think about all those kind of things. So that's all about planning the scenario. And then finally, we'll come to a summary of what we've done through that week as well. Then that takes us nicely on to week three. And week three is when you start actually looking at the nitty gritty of creating virtual scenarios. So the first thing we're going to look at is the technology. So week three is about developing your own virtual scenario. So the first thing we'll do is talk about the technology. So we'll introduce virtual scenario authoring systems. There are many out there. And they all have different features, but we won't obviously go into detail about all of them. We'll just give an overview of the different types that you may come across. Now, within the project, we have two exemplar systems that we're using, and one is the CASA system, which was developed by Instruct. The second is Open Labyrinth, which is an open source software, and both are great systems. And so we'll have links for both of the systems in there. We'll give some guidelines, link to guidelines, and hopefully also show some examples of scenarios in both of those as well. Moving on from the technology, we'll actually start thinking about what it actually takes to create a virtual scenario. So beyond the technology and planning what you actually need to do when you're authoring. So the first thing we're going to do is ask for the learners to actually share their ideas on what they think they might like to create a virtual scenario on. So get discussion going. Some people might not have an idea, but from the discussion they may get some ideas. And also we can feed into that discussion as well and give some tips and also advice on that as well. The second part of authoring a virtual scenario is to actually give the tips on writing a good scenario. And this is about actually making manageable option points within a scenario, also thinking about where you're setting the scenario, thinking about realistic options, and there's a lot of information that can go in there. So we'll be putting the tips in there too. So moving on from there, finally, we asked the learners to actually create their first virtual scenario, and we'll give them a guide on how to use the virtual scenario, and so that they know how to use the system. We'll ask them to create a mind map of their scenario, and all of that will be quite good for them to plan and start thinking about essentially storyboarding their virtual scenario. Then we'll ask them to actually go and do that on the system, and actually then share links with one another, and so that everyone can see one another's first attempts at creating a virtual scenario. Then we'll follow on with a summary, and the summary will go over the whole process it takes to create the virtual scenario, and that also includes things like getting feedback and actually piloting your scenario before running it live with the learners. And then finally we'll get a closing and some feedback as well. So that's what we're planning. So you can see 3 weeks, got an introduction to scenario-based learning, then we have introduction to virtual scenarios themselves, and then we go into the actual technology and getting your hands on and creating it. So now it's over to you guys. Now, the best way to do this is, if you have some feedback for us, initial thoughts, anything, is raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone for you, and so that you can give us some feedback. Alternatively, you're also able to use the chat functionality on here. So first of all, what do you think of the MOOC? Does it make sense to everyone? If you raise your hand, I am able to unmute you.